Hello, hey everyone. Sorry for being late for a couple of minutes. We were adjusting some technical things to start. So happy to have you, all of you here today. And so this meetup will be about cases from our colleagues from Switzerland and from Portugal. And it's nice of them that they decided to share their experience with the Ukrainian UX research community. Thank you for supporting our community with this kind of gesture. And so the agenda will be the same as usual. Miroslav will make his speech first. After that, we will have a short Q&A session. Please feel free to write your questions in the chat of this meeting. And after that, Stefan will make his speech, will share with us his experience, and then we'll have also a short Q&A session. It would be great for all of us and for people who joined if you could participate and donate to our army and support Ukrainian forces in this war. So I will share a link to Colo, and you will be able to donate any amount of money that you can, like 20 hryvnias, 50, 100, whatever you want. That will be also nice. So yeah, that's pretty much everything I wanted to say before we start. And I will ask Miroslav to share his screen, and he will present himself a little bit and tell you about interesting startup. This is like his volunteering job, and it will be nice to hear his experience there.
Hello, thank you very much for the nice introduction. Привет, Ukrainci. And I'm very happy to be here with you today. I'm Miroslav. I'm based in Portugal, born in Bulgaria, lived in the Netherlands for about 13 years. Currently, I'm working pro bono for a startup called InReach. And I just wanted to share my experience with the startup, how we do research about our technology, and how we try to advocate for LGBTQ plus community in North America. And let me briefly also share my screen. So we have some visuals. But yeah, as I mentioned, I wanted to share. Isn't the sound good as well? I'll speak up. Maybe this is the.
Yeah, it's better. Yeah.
It's all right. So as I mentioned, my name is Miroslav, and I work for this tech startup called InReach. We have a technology for the entire LGBTQ community in North America, mostly for asylum seekers, but also for homeless youth, for trans people looking for resources. And I wanted to share with you some points I wanted to discuss with you. Those relate to why this technology exists, and I will give a little bit of context about inequalities. My topic today is about spaces of hope and why I want to call my work or put my work in this context, that we're creating some spaces of hope. What do we mean by this? Of course, it's important to give you also the context of the organization, how it started, and what the technology looks like as well. I will briefly give you some introduction about the audience and people we work with, who do we help with, who are our partners. And the focus of my presentation would be also how we conduct UX research in a nonprofit, also the impact from research, but also on organizational level. Of course, our work comes with some challenges, and I'll share those with you, and also what we try to do in order to overcome them. And of course, some thoughts about the future of the organization and our research. So when we talk about inequalities, we need to consider several things here. I just wanted to give some overview of why there are so many people fleeing their home countries, because they don't feel safe in their environments, because in more than 80 countries, it's illegal to be openly LGBTQ person. And in other countries, it's even unsafe. And currently in the United States, there are over than 1.5 million cases backlogged, migration cases in the court system. And we know from research that it's about 21% that LGBTQ people are more likely to be living in poverty compared to the general population. Those are some of the inequalities people face. And I just wanted to give you this context because this is the things we try to tackle with our technology. And why this technology? Because we want to create the so-called spaces of hope. And I wanted to stretch here a little bit this academic concept by David Harvey, who is a human geographer and talked about working class in the United States and the continuous inequalities there. But he also sees that urban environment can be designed in more progressive way, in a way that allows for this disenfranchised group to live also well in the society, with the hope of architects and the unity of disenfranchised people. It's possible to unite communities and to work creatively for a new future. And in the context of tech, we can talk about architects, but mostly about engineers, people creating applications, and also those who work in cross-functional teams like researchers, designers. So those are the allies that will strive to create a more just environment. And in this context, I want to introduce you InReach, which is a tech startup based in New York. And we have an application for the entire LGBTQ plus community. And our mission is that basically you can seek LGBTQ resources, safety, and find belonging with our technology. How it all started. So in 2016-
Sorry, Miroslava.
Yes.
Sorry for interrupting. I just wanted to make sure if you change your slides, we don't see it, unfortunately. We see only the cover slide.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's interesting.
I think that we can go on with that.
Yeah, totally. Let's just move on.
Great, thanks.
Back to the story. And yes, the startup was founded in 2016 when our co-founders, Sai and Jamie, met in college. The organization was founded by an asylum seeker, an American trans man from a conservative family. They realized that there's a need for such resources, especially for those people fleeing persecution because of their LGBTQ plus status. And of course, they really discussed that everybody deserves to be safe and to live in freedom and have authentic life wherever they are. And our products, if I have to put it in the context of the theoretical framework I just introduced, the Spaces of Hope, is actually a catalog. It is available for the web and mobile, also for mobile web and native iOS and Android. Our technology is available in all 50 US states, the District of Columbia, and also in Canada, in Mexico. It is designed to instantly match LGBTQ plus people with service providers so that they can find verified safe, legal, medical, mental health, and social services. So Our technology is intended for the entire LGBTQ community. Those include, for example, asylum seekers, refugees, undocumented, other migrants, young people experiencing homelessness, people facing family or community rejection due to their identity, and other transgender and non-binary people in need for safe resources. I just wanted to share some quotes from previous users, and those are also people who use our technology to refer their clients to our platform. For example, one service provider said, okay, thanks again for sharing this incredible resource. I passed it on to someone looking for LGBT resource in Michigan already. It's so helpful. And also some of our team members used this platform while he was applying for asylum in the United States. And he said, InReach became my source to get me access to not only legal representation, but other kind of resources as well that would be helpful for anyone who's thinking of applying for asylum.
Sorry, we still see the story slide.
Right, the focus of my presentation is actually my work as a UX researcher. And I joined the team in 2020, just a little before the pandemic hit. And at the time, it was the first time we had a really dedicated UX team, and nobody had done any research on the mobile application. So this was our first task. But before we could actually reach out to participants, which was also very difficult at the time, my team wanted to start with basically understanding the technology much better and to see if we can use different methods, some methods that will deliver very quick fixes. So we did heuristic evaluation to understand the user flows, to see if there are any kind of flaws that can be quickly fixed by our design team. And so those were kind of low hanging fruits. For example, something related to the language, to the or to the navigation. We used this exercise to actually draft some tasks for further research. And actually, we were happy to conduct 2 rounds of usability testing with our technology. The first usability test session took place in 2021, and we interviewed 5 service providers in the United States. Think about lawyers, people who work on, for example, legal cases, people providing social services. And we spent about an hour with them showing, observing how they use the current technology. We use user Zoom for this. We were very lucky to be granted access to this platform because as a non-profit, we didn't have resources to conduct remote research, especially with a mobile application. So we were thinking of even implementing the so-called the laptop procedure, but it'd be very difficult also for people to have a laptop and mobile phone. So this was a very good way of conducting remote research. And the second round of research was with 5 Spanish-speaking LGBTQ people who had some migration history in the United States. And we wanted to test really the translation of the application, how Google Translate would help or not our direct users to navigate through the platform. Again, we used user Zoom to conduct this research. And some key findings from this research, or what were the impacts. So from the first round of research, we were able to identify 5 priorities that relates to, first of all, the vetting process. I didn't say that we had a 3-step verification process of all the resources that are part of the technology. So every service that is part of the platform needs to pass 3 criteria. First of all, needs to be active and legitimate. Second of all, should be LGBTQ plus affirming, and second of all, the resource should give access to asylum seekers and undocumented community members. But there was some issues with the vetting process. Our users were concerned that this process was not very clear. We also had discovered some opportunities to improve our filtering options. Also, we figure out that some of the visual language was not very consistent. So we had some recommendations for the language icon, and the language options were recognized, but our users were very concerned of how actually people in need would share these resources. And of course, our users kind of were concerned that they could only look for a resource by address and not by organization name. So this is something we proposed to our engineering team. And during the second wave of research, we understood that some organizations who were part of the Mexico catalog were not really LGBTQ plus affirming. So our resource manager really investigated this issue and tried to provide better steps to their team so that they could really spotlight those unfriendly organizations. And we're also working in the future to hire local resource expert in Mexico who would really help out the verification process. And I remember that I had some updates from the organization. So the impact on the organizational level. So recently, the company rebranded itself. We have a new logo, mission that resonates with the entire LGBTQ community. Previously, the organization was known as Asylum Connect, but it was the name didn't resonate very well with the whole community because we're not only focusing on the asylum seekers. And I could say that ever since the platform was launched, we managed to match over 140 people with direct services. Also, we managed to vet over than 6,000 services. We're very thankful to all the team members, volunteers, interns, and staff members who do this every 6 months, following the three-step verification process I briefly mentioned. And what is also important is to consider the importance of this database and as a centralized information place that is also recognized by lawyers and paralegals. Our technology is also trusted by LGBTQ plus resource seekers due to its emphasis on confidentiality, user safety, and affirming care. We don't collect any personal information. People are not really required to create an account with the platform. They can use it whenever they want from wherever they are in North America. Also, people who are planning their trip can also look at the catalog and see what resources are available in which cities they want to migrate to. And we also have a junior board program. This is a program directly targeting young professionals who serve as direct ambassadors in their own community. And some of the things we were happy to achieve in the previous years and months. And recently we also won a grant from called World Justice Challenge. We also, as a nonprofit startup, we really appreciate all the donations because this is the only way the company can sustain itself. But all the joys, with all the joys, there are also challenges, and some of those relates to, well, the COVID situation that really stagnated our work because it was very difficult to find people to test the technology. And imagine people in distress, they would be nowhere to find because we nearly needed to communicate with direct service providers, but all services were closed. And it was almost impossible. And also the political climate in the world was also kind of preventing us from reaching out to users at the time. And establishing trust was also a big issue. And we're very happy that our trusted partners were able to refer their clients to our team so that we can have some connections, but we're still working on this front. Sometimes it's very difficult to come together as a team because we're all volunteers and we also have other tasks besides volunteering. So this is also a challenge we have to deal with. And as I mentioned, it was very difficult to find a platform that would allow us to test the technology remotely, but we were very happy to have this grant from user testing. And Spanish was a big hurdle up until the moment we found a volunteer who speaks Spanish. So he actually conducted the second round of research with Spanish speakers. And our biggest hurdle at the moment is to have really a full stack engineer who would lead our team and also envision our product map. And we're actually, this is one of the few paid positions. So if you know anybody who would be willing to take on this role, can visit our website or reach out to me. And we have a lot of partners from legal partners, technical support, and previously also had some corporate and branding partners. And I just wanted to give shout out to the creative agency Be Real, which helped with the rebranding of the startup and our technology. And last but not least, some points for in the future. So our organization plans to introduce new non-English translation. Also, we plan to have a resource navigation helpline. And last but not least, a direct referral support would also be implemented. And thank you very much for staying with me during all the technical travels. And here are my contact information details if you want to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Miroslav. Thank you. Unfortunately, we couldn't see all the slides, so we just listened to your story. Could you please share the slide where you wanted to, the people that you're looking for, like the developer, full stack developer, and other people that you're looking for? Could you share the slide so everybody could see which people you need for your project? Thank you so much. Yeah, and everybody who has any questions to Miroslav, to his project and work he shared with us, feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly. If you don't want to unmute yourself, you're shy, you can just write your question to the chat. So I can start and ask a question from me. So I will be first. Miroslav, could you please tell me more about translation? You mentioned that you conducted some research with Spanish-speaking people, and you used like Google Translate for this. How did you moderate this session?
Yeah, very good one.
Can you tell me about this experience?
Yeah, so our technology, this application, is available in various languages, but we use Google Translate for the app. And we had a volunteer who is a native Spanish speaker. And the reason for conducting the research with Spanish speaker is because the majority of migrants come from Mexico, and they're mostly from Latin America. So people who speak Spanish, so we really wanted to see, even with this limited translation, could they still really understand our technology? And thanks to our volunteer, we could understand where the biggest flaws are there. And of course, well, it's not ideal to have Google Translate, but it's still something. We're working on a native translation of the app, at least for Spanish and some other main languages. But this was, big hurdle. The language barrier is a big hurdle. So it's still a work in progress. Well, but the volunteers really helped on the one hand to have the interviews, and yeah, technologically speaking, this is what we have currently, basically.
Yeah, that's quite a challenge. Okay, thank you. So we have a raised hand here. Sergey, could you please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, guys, hi. Thanks for this presentation. Miroslava, I have a question. So at some point of time, someone in the company or you decided that you need to conduct UX research. My question is that, so how did you prepare for that UX research in terms of defining metrics, or what is success for this UX research? So you've done some work, but how can you evaluate that this work was useful? That's the question, basically, because a lot of people doing some work, but do not even understand whether it was helpful or not. They just have done some work, that's it. How did you answer that question? Was it useful or not for your company?
Yeah, excellent question, Sergey. Well, let me answer you like this. As a startup, whatever information you have to move your technology forward is very useful. But in this particular case, we were like 5 people, and we really spent a lot of time understanding the user flows and really design tasks that would really kind of unravel the whole journey. So we really wanted to find different opportunities and struggles people had. So we followed the user journey to investigate if for some reasons they really struggle with the main purpose of this application. When we had conversation with the stakeholders beforehand, how useful or not our questions would be in terms of tasks. And once we presented the research, they could also see some of the priorities they had to execute in the technical roadmap. So in this respect, we could see the progress of the technology by flagging some usability issues. And this was the first time anybody conducted research with the mobile application in this respect. And we also had some benchmarks to gauge the general attitudes of our respondents, but we also used some usability skills that would also help us in the future to see if our work really has some incremental changes in the future. So this would be my response. So basically, having a discussion with the stakeholders afterwards is the eliminating moment of how useful or not your research would be. Yeah.
Sergey, did Miroslav answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. I wrote that everything was clear.
Okay, we have another question. What was the main challenge in the research for this project?
Well, in this case, it was finding really the right participants, and I just listed some reasons why it was difficult: the COVID situation, the political situation, the fact that those people really flee persecution, and we needed to establish trust. It was a big challenge. And the other thing is like finding a good technology to test our application remotely. It was another challenge, just to name a few.
And if to continue this question, how did you solve the problem with participants?
Yes, now we have, that's a very good one. Luckily, the situation kind of got a little bit better when all service providers started to working with clients. We were able to have more direct contact. So that's why we firstly tested the application with service providers. Also, another things that helped was probably referrals. Somebody in our network or who had contact with the community centers contacted people, and this is how we also recruited for the general users, our target group. But also now we have an intern who help us with really contacting our service provider. So the service providers, we also have a recruitment flyer with detailed information, what is required from participants. So these are little things that help.
Okay, I see. And we have another question also from Julia. Did you make any researches about how to make the platform more viral and to build the growth loop?
No, we didn't make. We haven't done research in this domain yet. No.
Sorry, can I ask a little bit more questions, because the virality is particularly interesting for me, because I participate in a project with the social discovery theme, and it's very interesting for me. How did you go to market, and how did you invite the first users for your platform? And by the way, how many people are there right now?
Answer, because I have we have the annual report with all the numbers, how many people currently use the technology. I'm not sure how we had really the discoverability research, how was the discovery research or the market research was done, but we can definitely see that there is a market fit for the technology currently. Of course, I do not know much about how participants were recruited, but as a non-profit, probably they just had some prototypes and evaluated what was the general use, but I'm not sure that it was particularly some effort about looking at a target audience, but there should have been, but I was not involved at the time, so I cannot really answer your question, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you. And I have like a last question to Miroslav. Do you think that UX research helped you to get grant for this project?
Oh, well, actually, it's not really the. You mean grants, the donations, or?
Yes, yeah, donations.
Well, it's not only the research, it's everybody's work. It's collaborative work, the visibility of the technology, all the positive remarks from service providers that are referring our technology probably, and the general mission of the company.
Yeah, that's true. Teamwork. Great, thank you so much. We have to move on. I see that we have some other questions, but Miroslav, we have to move on. So thank you so much for your presentation. Despite that we had some technical issues, anyway, it was really interesting, and wish you luck with your project. Okay, Stefan. So Stefan is a UX researcher from YouTube, and we wanted him to be a speaker on the conference that we wanted to organize this summer, but unfortunately we had to postpone the conference. But Stefan agreed to have a speech today on the meetup. So Stefan, I give a word to you. Could you share your screen? Okay.
So, hi. I work in UX, believe it or not. My name is Stevhen Wheeler. I'm a UX researcher, and I work at Google YouTube. And I've been at Google YouTube for about 10 years, in fact, 10 years in September, so quite a long time. And I worked in Silicon Valley almost for, well, more than 20 years, a long time. I moved to Switzerland with YouTube about 3 years ago. And it's an honor for me to speak to everybody here. I didn't think that I was going to get the chance to do this because I first started talking to Daria in February. And then, of course, we all know what happened. But as I said, it's a real pleasure to speak to everybody. And I hope this is going to be useful. And I do also hope that I'm going to pitch this at the right level. It's really hard to know, talking to an external audience, what level to pitch things at. So I do hope that, you know, I'm not going to go into too much detail, or worse, to go into too little detail and talk about things that people know about. Anyhow, I'm going to be talking about how we can use quant and qual research methods in combination and how useful that is. And I'm going to finish with a method that actually kind of does these two things in one method, which is quite a nice thing. So you might be familiar with something like this, which is, it's in fact a former colleague of mine. I used to work at Yahoo, this guy called Christian Rohrer. He devised this kind of landscape of user research methods. And you might be familiar with most of, if not all of these. The way he's set this out, he's kind of divided things between qualitative at the bottom here and quant at the on the lower right, and also between attitudinal and behavioral. Now, we're all familiar with the basic types of usability study, which tend to be in this lower left quadrant here. This is you know, the classical kind of, well, in fact, they're right here, slightly in the upper left quadrant. So when we do this type of lab study, this is when we're doing observational things. We're doing it with small samples. But there's some magic that can be sprinkled on the whole landscape of user research methods when we go into doing things at scale. And when we do things more at scale, we tend to move into this upper right quadrant here. And here's where we're doing things more quantitatively. We're definitely getting things at a more behavioral than attitudinal level. We're also doing things with large numbers of people. That's what quantitative means. And we also tend to do things. This is when more remote methods come into play. So there's always a question about what methods to use, you know, when to apply which methods. And it's one of the things that as you become more established as UX researcher, you become more familiar, more comfortable with different methods. You also become more familiar with knowing how to apply them. And kind of the secret sauce is here, that it starts with the research question that you're dealing with. So this is the thing that your stakeholders are talking to you about, and you're sitting in meetings with them, and people want to find things out. And our job really as researchers is to translate that into a research question and then apply a method to it. That's kind of basically how I think our job really is. And then the application of it, and then the presentation results and all the rest of it follows from that. But of course, the method that we choose, it will depend largely on where we are in the product life cycle. So when we're starting out in the exploratory phase, we tend to do things that are a little bit more qualitative, definitely more exploratory. And as we move through the life cycle, we tend to do things that become a little bit more generative and a little bit more evaluative towards the end. And the at-scale methods come into their own in the evaluative phases, in the evaluative phases on the right-hand side here. So a little bit later, when things have kind of moved towards actually coming up with concrete design. Sometimes people talk about this stuff on the left as being foundational. Sometimes they talk about this stuff on the right as being tactical. I don't like that distinction. I think tactical kind of devalues the work that we do later on and things with actual design. That's maybe because I'm biased and I like doing at-scale research methods. But anyhow. So another really important thing about being a UX researcher is to know that the application of multiple methods is a very important thing for us. And the reason for that is that for many problems, you simply can't get the answer. There is no the answer, by the way, but we can't get really close to the answer with the application of a single method. And just to let you all know, when I started working in this field, which is back in the 1990s now, UX research didn't really exist as a job description. It was my job title was usability engineer, and that kind of pegged me into working in usability labs pretty much all the time. We didn't really have any other methods. That's all we did. And when I look back on that, I think that's a really very short-sighted approach to how research can help design, because we just didn't apply different methods, and we critically, we would apply the wrong method to try to answer certain questions that really weren't suited for the lab. I'll come into that in a little more detail in some slides I've got coming up. Yeah, so generally, if you have a method that's trying to address a question that's a why type of a question, rarely is that going to give you the answer to what or how many or which thing which design do people prefer, and vice versa. So this leads to the fact that we actually need to apply multiple methods. And very often, this is called triangulation, by the way, and very often that means combining different types of maybe qual methods with quant or at-scale methods together. I'll go into more detail about that in subsequent slides. So yeah, in fact, here we are. So at-scale methods, what these do is they complement qual UXR methods. So observations from, for example, a lab study, a qualitative small sample lab study, that might be hard to validate. You know that you've seen something you think is valid, you've seen it happen multiple times in the lab, but your stakeholders might say things like, well, in the real world, how severe is this observation really going to be? Or, you know, how representative were your participants who came in on that Monday morning? Or they might say, well, you only had 6 of them, and that's not enough. And those objections, they have a certain amount of validity to them. But we can address them by choosing at-scale methods. Yeah, and by doing this is going to add validity and reliability to our insights, regardless of where they come from. And it allows us to defend our observations and our research findings more confidently. So how do we go beyond the Usability Lab? So, and what is this at-scale stuff? What characterizes it? Well, mostly it's the application of remote and unmoderated methods to our research problems. And these will typically involve large numbers of participants. It sort of makes sense. You know, we're just talking about things that are done at scale. But this is the things that characterize them. So, you know, our traditional qualitative methods, things like in the lab with 6 people, or maybe a diary study with you know 10 people or something like that. This is different from that, and it's going to do things at greater scale. And this does allow us to have more precision in our results. And with the complementary nature of what we're doing now in triangulation, we are able to generalize our results more thoroughly. And it's also a characteristic of this is we're moving from insights that are descriptions of what's going on to measures of the effect that these phenomena could have in the real world. Yeah, so when we're doing our lab studies, we're finding out things like why do people behave in a certain way. When you're moderating a usability study and you see somebody doing something and it looks like there's a problem with the design, your immediate job is to say, why is this happening? Or probe, get more information about what's going on, because then you have an audience you know, a captive audience of a participant, and they can explain to you why this appears to be a design problem. But at scale methods, they do something quite different, and it asks you, they will answer questions about what is the cause of something, or how much or how big is this effect. So they're quite different questions that get answered by these different methods. I think I've kind of covered this already, but the types of questions that I'm talking about that qual methods can't really address, and that at-scale methods are much better for, are questions such as preference. You know, do users prefer design A or B or C or even D? It's actually very hard to do that in a usability lab reliably. You've probably seen people try it, but the samples are so small. You might have sort of 4, you know, a sample of maybe 7 people coming in. Maybe 4 prefer one, 3 another. It just isn't enough for you to make a definitive statement about preference. Another one might be to do with benchmarking. Has performance improved? If we're measuring CUJs, it's much better to do this at scale because we can actually measure improvements and maybe even present the results statistically and do comparative analysis one point in time against another. Another one might be which parts of the screen do people tap when they're attempting a task? Very interesting. What task flows do people choose through a UI? And you can find this out with prototype testing. I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Another one is what are the best icon and label for a given context? This is kind of a modification of a preference study, if you like, because you can run multiple different comparative evaluations of icons and labels and look at performance, look at preference. You can't really do that in the lab. You have to go out and do this at scale. Another one is information architecture. I'll talk about that. There's a specific method or family of methods that we can apply to generate and evaluate IAs. Another great thing about at-scale methods is the fact that they're location independent. And we know how important this is, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. We've been displaced from our offices and from our normal working patterns because of COVID. And all of you, people working in Ukraine, a lot of you have been displaced from where you live. And if you're trying to get local people or representative people, it's going to be hard. But our at-scale methods can actually allow us to reach people regardless of borders. So this is pretty useful. One of our initial problems when we were thinking about this, way back when in the US, was that all of our participants would come from Silicon Valley where we were working, and most of those people were pretty sophisticated technically. And so it actually, it unlocks us from that problem and allows us to get people from parts of the country or parts of the world that otherwise we wouldn't be able to reach in person. So nice advantage there. And another one is the fact that we can collect data rapidly. And the reason for this is that the data collection from at-scale methods tends to be concurrent rather than sequential. And so when you launch a study, be it a survey or a card sort or a prototype evaluation or something like this, the data collection is happening concurrently. And I've run studies in which data collection will run from start to finish in less than an hour, and I'll have hundreds, if not thousands, of data points ready for me to analyze. And so it becomes very, very quick for me to run these types of things repeatedly. In addition to this, we can templatize our study design and the way that we deploy our studies, and also how we do the analysis of data. And this allows us to be very rapid and very responsive. And so we can turn around studies in really double quick time. So this is another unexpected but great advantage of using these different methods. And another thing about them is they're quite inexpensive, surprisingly. I'm a heavy user of something called Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is a crowdsourcing marketplace. And for certain types of research study, which require only a few seconds or a few minutes of somebody's attention, we can actually make micropayments of maybe 50 US cents. And so when you get hundreds of responses, it actually doesn't cost very much money to run a study like this. So for example, this is my slide deck from which I got this slide is a little old, it's about 5 years old, but the data are pretty much the same. But anyway, in that year, I conducted about 20 studies using Mechanical Turk with about 15,000 people, and the total cost was about $4,000. Now, I understand this could be prohibitive in certain regions, and depending on who you're doing. And I'm working for a company that has lots and lots of money, but still, if you have access to a certain amount of resources, this is a good way to be very cost effective. So I'm going to talk about some tools and methods that we use for at-scale research. And there are many of them. So in fact, there's pretty much one tool for every method. In fact, there are kind of multiple tools because there are lots of different tool vendors that we can sample from. The previous presentation was talking about using, I think it was user testing or user Zoom. They are very similar in what they offer. And sometimes it comes down to a matter of choice as to which one you might use. Again, at Google, we're very well resourced, and so we have licenses for most of the leading tools, and we can choose which one we like. And sometimes it comes down to preference, but mostly it comes down to choosing the best method for the question that you have in hand. And just as there is no single method that can really fully address a research question, there's also no universal tool for at-scale research. So for example, Qualtrics, it's a very, very good survey tool. And I think it has some sort of a card sorting application as well, but I would never use it for that. It's not specific enough. And there's a much better tool that I use from its Optimal Workshop, in fact, that I use for card sorting. Optimal Workshop is great for card sorting, but its survey tool is it's not very good. So in fact, when I do a card sort, I'll actually I'll link the two together. I'll actually distribute my card sort through a survey, and at the end of the card sort, I'll send people back to the survey where I can ask better questions in a better environment for that type of thing. So that's generally how it works, at least for me. Okay, I'm just going to do a really quick kind of run through of some of the methods that I have used, and I'm going to finish with one that I've kind of devised, which is kind of an interesting example. But for remote unmoderated usability studies, now I think everyone's familiar with what a usability study is. And the reason you might do a remote and unmoderated one is that you want to do it with more people. And another advantage of doing this is that you can actually start to do things that you can't really do in a usability lab because you simply haven't got the time and resources. And so when you do things at scale with a lab study, you can do things like have exactly the same tasks, but slightly different designs. And you can look at different performance or even preference through this type of method. And I've done this before very successfully. UserZoom is very good at controlling how users perform tasks. You set it up to for people to step through tasks, and at the end of a task, they think when they've done something successfully, they can take a quick survey and give you their subjective feeling about their task experience. And there are some metrics that come back from it that allow you to make some comparisons. So it's pretty good. We're on the way to doing randomized controlled experiments here. Pretty good. And the other thing about this is you can embed live products inside UserZoom. So people are doing real tasks, maybe even with their own accounts. So that's pretty fab if you can do this sort of thing. Now I talked about card sorting before, and I talked about how I use Optimal Sort as the specific tool for this. I assume that people know this, but I'll just say it anyway. So the reason you would do a card sort generally is to understand what the user's mental model is of a product or a domain. And the reason you want to do this is that you want to generate information about how an information architecture should be organized. Having these cards, the way that people organize them together, I think the ideal sample size is about 50 for a typical card sort. You can get a sense of how people group concepts that would exist within this domain, within this product, how they group them together. And one of the outputs will be something like this thing here, which is called a similarity matrix. And here it's showing really quite clearly that we have clusterings of items that suggest that these things live together within a UI. So then the UI designer should take this information and say, well, now I know how to organize the product or how to generate a menu structure or something like that. So that's the whole point of doing this. So this is a generative at scale method. And now if we want to evaluate the IA without building a product, we can use something called tree testing. And there are a number of different vendors that offer tree testing, but Optimal Sort is one that I've used. I think their product is really good. It's called TreeJack. You might have heard of it. And generally what it's done is, what it does, what it supports is the evaluation of findability. So once you've generated your IA, it creates this sort of abstracted representation, almost like a sort of menu structure. And so when you give people a task, such as the one that I'm showing on the right-hand side, people will, they're required to sort of open up these kind of menus and then find the item that they think matches that would achieve the task they're trying to complete. And again, it collects rather beautiful data, such as this tree thing here, and it kind of shows where people would like to, whether it would expect to go. So it's sort of this is a way of evaluating the IA that you've generated through a card sort. Very, very useful, and so it identifies your deficiencies or efficiencies in your design, and also shows you where you can potentially have design improvement. And a great reason to do this is that you can get information about the efficiency of a potential design before any UI has been committed by your UI designer. So it's kind of heading off problems early and giving very clear indications as to where to go before the heavy work begins. In no particular order, another method that we use at Google a lot is logs analysis. And we examine logs data if we want to look at user behavior. And this is really done on live products. So once something's gone live, we heavily instrument our UIs. And so we have lots and lots of logs data that we can collect and look at comparatively as well. You can look at it. So in fact, at Google, I've got a note here about this, but we have the ability to do comparative logs analysis because we have very many different versions of a product design that exist at any one time. And so we can look at different performances of those different designs and see which ones are working in the way that we might expect them to do. And of course, we can also do this in a time sequence. So you can make a change and then see what happens as a result of that change. Very often you get this phenomenon of change aversion where people don't like a UI and it looks as if they're becoming rather inefficient, but then that will normalize and you might see that people start to become more efficient in using the design. So again, you would use this sort of thing in combination with other things that you know, the insights that you've gathered from different types of study as a UX researcher. So this will require working cross-functionally. So very often, the people who are looking at logs analysis will be not even quantitative user experience researchers, but many times data scientists. So we'll work together with those people to come up with our insights for the whole team. Another one is surveys. This is probably the commonest at-scale method that we use at Google. In fact, a lot of people don't think of surveys as being a research method, but they very much are. And we have, again, we're lucky, Google has lots of different resources, and we have lots of different survey tools available to us depending on our need. And we have very simple surveys that anybody can use, just part of the Google suite of applications called Google Forms. And we tend to use those really for informal purposes, maybe simple internal surveys, and not really as a research tool. You can, but I tend to advise against them. But we have some others. So there's something called Google Surveys, which is a publicly available product. It costs a little bit of money to use, but it's a global product that allows you to sample internet users across the world. It's pretty fantastic. And the way that it works is instead of a paywall, a user can access a website, so for example, the New York Times, by taking one of these surveys. And so you can get data from real users pretty quickly. And this is really a wonderful tool. And the surveys are very simple. Because people aren't really being paid, so you can't really expect them to give too much of their time to you. And so the surveys tend to be rather simple. I think there's a limit of 10 questions, but when I run them, I'll probably have no more than 3 or 4 questions. But I've done prototype evaluations, not prototype evaluations, icon evaluations using Google Surveys, because you can run multiple ones of these at the same time and look at, for example, which icon somebody would associate with a given concept. And you can look at the comparative results from different surveys and see which ones really resonate with people. And this has been very successful for us. But we can also use more complex surveys. We have tools such as, well, we have Qualtrics deployed in-house. Qualtrics is one of the market leaders for enterprise-ready surveys. And when you do this, you tend to be sending these to specific samples, so panels of users that we have. We have a big recruiting database and we can send surveys to people that way, for example. Now, I want to talk about something that's kind of an interesting mashup of different methods. And internally, we've called this Flowtrix. And the reason it's called Flowtrix is that we used to have a prototyping tool called Flow, which is a Google thing, internal. And those things were embedded into Qualtrics surveys. So we kind of jammed the whole thing together and it became Flowtrix. And this is an ability for us to do the evaluation of designs at scale. And so what we do is we actually build a web-based prototype and embed that into survey pages in Qualtrics. And I've been doing it actually for a number of years now, but it's a way of doing click testing experiments at scale. And it can be phenomenally useful. And we can do this for desktop products. And there's an example here of something that's running on mobile. And one of the real advantages of this is that we can actually, in the same study, collect both quant and qual data at the same time. And the reason we can do, the way that we can do this is that we can get the kind of what information, which is kind of the qual stuff, by looking at specific metrics, such as which targets people clicked on, how long it took them to complete a task, or something of that nature. And the qual stuff I'm talking about is the subjective survey responses that you just get when people are taking a survey anyway, or their open-ended feedback. And so that's kind of the why part. And so in one thing, a survey can have a task and then a prototype, and people try to complete the task in the prototype, and that will pipe back into a normal survey inside the survey for them to respond to questions about how easy they thought that task was, and then any open-ended question open-ended feedback they may have about the experience they've just had. This is great. It's, you know, just all the things I said before. It's rapid and very inexpensive because we use Mechanical Turk. I was telling you about that. And, you know, for about 2 minutes of people's time, I can maybe pay them 50 cents. And for maybe 100 or 200 responses per cell, if I'm doing some sort of, comparative evaluation, maybe, that amounts to a few $100s only. And it takes a few hours for the data to be collected for that entire sample. So it's pretty amazing when it runs. And the advantage of this is that it allows us to make design decisions really early. So if you're working with a UX design colleague and they are wrestling with, you know, should we have design A or B? Normally you get sent into the usability lab and you go, oh, my goodness, I've only got 7 people coming. I don't think I can actually make this decision reliably. You can do this with this method, get hundreds of responses and iterate and see which designs work with people, see why things work or do not work. And so it's got some big advantages. It's high validity, high reliability, done at scale, mixing quantum qual together, low cost and rapid deployment. So it has a lot of advantages. And also we can take advantage of Qualtrics functionality and actually design experiments this way. So first of all, we can build our prototypes. So Qualtrics allows us to build things in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript because the survey pages themselves are just web pages, and it allows you to embed your own HTML inside them. It allows for data storage, so we can capture this information about things like time to complete, which targets they clicked on. And we can do things like randomization, which is just an inherent property of Qualtrics. And so you can randomly send people into prototype A or prototype B, or even into task 1 or task 2. And so you can design within, between subjects, experiments. So you have at your disposal, using this method, really a lot of the possibility for experimental manipulation. And there's really no need to build anything other than your prototype. So the prototypes themselves, so initially, when I started doing this, I'd hand code them in HTML, and I had to learn how to do JavaScript, jQuery stuff actually in CSS. I got to be pretty good at this, but this became kind of the longest part of the whole process, because it's not my role really. I enjoy it, but frankly, this was taking me too much time. Now we use a tool called Figma, which is kind of this universal prototyping tool at Google and outside as well. And we found a way to embed these prototypes and have all these measures I was just talking about. Now, the prototypes themselves, they actually need to be pretty simple. So they have as much interactivity to support only the task that you are interested in doing. So it might be something like find the button to subscribe to a channel. So something as simple as that, it doesn't have to have very much interactivity. And so building it doesn't have to be very complicated, which is another advantage, because it means that building and deploying these little experiments is very, very quick. And again, as I said before, we need to capture things like which targets are clicked, what the timestamps are for certain events, like where the first click was, what the target click, the completion task, what that timestamp is. And so once we have that data, we can do comparative evaluations within the same study. So quick summary of advantages of this method: very quick to turn around, no custom tools, well, except for the Figma thing I was talking about, but you can hand code your prototypes. By the way, I'm assuming you have access to some sort of tool like Qualtrics, so you may not. But maybe this slide is aimed at Googlers, but still, it's relatively inexpensive to do. So I think I've covered all that stuff. And I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation. Oh yeah, quickly, when not to use this type of a method. Sometimes, if you need a fully functioning UI, it's just not going to go. It's going to be too complicated to do this. So we haven't done any sort of Flowtrix things at Google to test the entire suite of CUJs, not even one of them, because some of these end-to-end flows can be pretty complicated. And therefore, you'd need a fully functioning prototype to do that. This is really for micro tasks and not for highly complex interactions. And it's also not very good for general qualitative usability data. If that's the case, go to the lab. The lab is fantastic for that. And also, because we're using prototypes, it's not getting contextual data. Actually, one of my colleagues is trying to work on this to embed real Google products within our Flowtrix experiments. And I'm really keen to see where this would go, because this would add some really useful dimensions to data that we're collecting, because it would be using users' actual accounts. So that would be pretty cool. So an example of this, just to kind of wrap things up, we had some indications of a few years ago that people didn't know how to use something called Watch Later, which we thought was a fairly common thing. Watch Later is basically a YouTube playlist, and if you find a video that you like and you want to watch later, well, how do you do that? And it turned out that we had some indications that people didn't know what the icon was. It's this thing actually with the, there are a couple of them actually. There's one up here with the green box around it, another one with the red box around it. Yeah, so we had some indication from the lab, some suggestion that these weren't discoverable. And so we actually devised a Flowtrix study to explore this more. And we got some very good signals as to why this was the case. So it turns out that, first of all, those icons were suboptimal. They didn't represent save or watch later very well. And also there were some other icons around that were attracting clicks away from that. So we probably wouldn't have got this information had we not been able to use this method. Because for the type of data that we wanted to indicate the extent of the problem, the scale of the problem, we really had to have large numbers of respondents and not the sort of 7 or 8 that you get in a 6, 7 or 8 that you get in a usability study. So this is where this type of method really comes into its own. I'm going to wrap up now, but you can also just, in your normal course of being a UX researcher, you can just put these things into combination anyway. And a few years ago, I came up with this acronym called CATNIP, which was describing a series of methods that you can put together either individually or in series or in combination to help with product design, generating and evaluating an IA, labels, icons, and things like that. And CATNIP stood for card sorting, tree testing, name evaluation, icon evaluation, and then prototype testing using Flowtrix. The name and icon evaluation stuff, that was done with Google surveys, and the card sorting and tree testing was done with Optimal Sort. So a whole series of different at-scale methods chained together, low cost, very quick to deploy, and very useful information for a product. That's it. Thank you very much. I've got about 5 minutes of questions left, so appreciate everybody listening to me so far.
Thank you, Stefan, so much.
Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions in the chat. So Miroslav asked you, will Google Forms soon allow to create ranking questions?
Oh, I don't know. Probably, I would guess. A completely unauthoritative response, probably, because I would bet that's the case because they are always extending their functionality and it's becoming a better product by the year. But it's intended to be a fairly simple product. It's not really a kind of enterprise level survey system in the way that Qualtrics, or there's another one called Confirm It. yeah, it's not really intended to do that sort of thing. So one of the reasons that Qualtrics and Confirmit are so useful is the fact that they're customizable, and you can kind of break them open and do this prototyping. And because they're basically web pages, you can write your own code and make them do dynamic things. The way I started doing this, sorry, slightly gone off Google Forms here, but was simply that I remember sort of thinking that you can just do an evaluation of a design using a survey, and then, well, how do you embed the image into a survey? Well, it's simple. You just use an image tag. And then once you've worked that out, then you can do something else and some other HTML tag, and then it just goes on from there. So, but Forms doesn't really allow you to do that. It's probably never going to get to that point, but it's a pretty good tool. Yeah, we use it internally. I don't recommend that we use it for external purposes, just as a kind of yardstick there.
Okay, thank you for your answer. We have a raised hand. Alex, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, Stefan, thanks a lot for your talk. It was really interesting. Well, I have a question about this, your tool, which is called Flowtrix, right?
Yes.
How do you analyze all these quality questions or quality research questions? Because you have a lot of responses, kind of hundreds of. So how? Which do you analyze all of them, which is probably not possible? I mean,
Yes.
Qualitative questions, or you just randomly choose some of them?
Right. Okay. So actually, I think that is a question that applies to all survey research and not just Flowtrix, because if you design a survey and you have an open-ended question, and you have hundreds of responses, you're going to have potentially hundreds of open-ended responses to analyze as well. Yeah, so the analysis of open-ended responses is a challenge for any UX researcher, but I think it's one that's worth everybody going through to learn how to do it. Because actually, so if you make an open-ended survey question, it should be optional, so you shouldn't be forcing people to give you a response anyway. So you'll probably get a subset of your responses only will have open ends in them. So in a typical survey, you'll probably have maybe 100 or 200, and it doesn't take a great deal of effort really to do that, maybe an afternoon. I remember friends of mine, colleagues of mine, years ago, absolutely hating this because they have to read every single one. But you have to learn how to code open-ended responses into categories. And so it becomes an exercise of doing that. And you become quick at it. In fact, your first couple of times maybe if you take a sample of 50 of your open ends, you will develop a schema of open-ended codes that you can then categorize all of the other responses into pretty quickly. So that's a general thing about coding survey open-ended responses anyway. So back to Flowtrix, I think the open-ended responses in there will be fairly simple to code because they'll be pretty directed. It'll say things like, I didn't understand the icon, or it wasn't clear how to do that task. So they tend to be of only one or two categories, and it becomes a pretty straightforward activity to do this. And I usually find that will complement the other survey data that I will get. So let's say I've done a Flowtrix evaluation with design A and design B. So I will know, based on Qualtrics' its internal data, it's called embedded data, I'll know which condition somebody was in. So therefore I can subdivide the comments into whether they saw A or B. And I can even look at the frequencies of open-ended comments depending on which category people were in, and see if they even differ. But yes, I might get sort of frequencies of categories of people saying things like the icon wasn't clear, or I was confused by the button that said deploy, or whatever it might be. And you can look to see if you have a comparative difference between these things. But in a Flowtrix experiment, they won't be very complex. It's not as if you're asking somebody about a whole product. it's really a small task that people have done. So it becomes pretty straightforward. And again, it's complementary with the survey data that you will have got back from them, which will, let's say you have a satisfaction question that says, overall, how, or an ease of use question, overall, how easy or difficult was it to complete that task? You know, from 5-point scale, extremely difficult, extremely easy with midpoint, and then an open-ended question, typical sort of scenario. So then you can do the analysis. Do you get a difference in the frequency of those responses between A and B? And how does that tally with your other measures, such as time to complete, how many clicks they made, where they clicked? So you start to get this really big picture about what's going on with a particular design or a particular comparison. So yeah, it's not difficult to do, and it's worth the effort, and it's only a couple of hundred, usually.
Okay, but I have one more question about this. But what it's about attitudinal data, what people say. But what about behavioral data, for example, when we can observe the behavior, how they try to find something? It's not that they say, it's something that we could only observe, right? So we need to watch all these sessions.
No, you don't see any, no, there's no recording. It just comes back as, what we do is, the prototype has, inside the prototype, we instrument things like where they click.
Okay.
So, and then they get stored inside something called, well, in Qualtrics, it's called an embedded data variable. So it simply comes out with the survey data. Yeah. So it's as if they actually gave you a survey response. So for example, I might, very simply, I might do a something like a target. You know, when they clicked that target, what is the timestamp? So when they start the experiment, it starts running a timer, and then they click on the end goal after a certain number of milliseconds. So very basically, if there's a task flow through a UI, a simple UI, a prototype, then I can know when people started and when people finished. And so again, if I'm doing an A/B, I can make a comparison between the average time to complete the task on design A versus the average time to complete on design B. And it simply comes back in the data of the survey. So I just get one simple file, which I would normally get through Qualtrics anyway, and I just analyze it in the way that I would normally look at a survey. And I can, I do things like cross tabs, or what are they called in Google Sheets, pivot tables. So I can break out my data by task A, task B, or design A and B, and look at comparative metric performances. So that's kind of the crux of the whole thing, that it's collecting both quant at scale data, but also survey data, and then in quotation marks, qual data, the open ends. It's not really qual, but you know what I mean. I'm not actually there to observe them, but it's kind of this mishmash of both at scale and semi-qualitative information as well.
Okay, thank you.
Stephen, one short question. What instrument do you use to code the open-ended answers? Do you do it just in Google?
Google Sheets. I use Google Sheets. Yeah. Very, very basically. One column will have the open-ended in it. So column F will have all the open ends, and then I'll add. I'll create a worksheet that has 2 or 3 or 4 columns where I will put the categories. So let's say somebody in a regular survey, let's say I have a lot of open-ended survey responses, and I'm asking about product experience, and people say the product's too expensive, and the upload doesn't work, and it's hard to use. They're telling me 3 things basically. One is about price, one is about ease of use, and another one is about functionality. And so now I have these 3 categories, and sometimes comments have multiple categories in them. The example I've just given, that's 3 categories per comment. So I'll add a number of columns to the right-hand side and simply have these as drop downs, and so I can very quickly code each row of that column F that has the comments in it. And then you can do some sort of good old Google spreadsheet stuff to look at frequencies of open-ended comments. In Flowtrix, I don't do this so much because, as I was explaining to the last person, it's not really collecting general open-ended feedback, but in other applications, I've just done a big project with some colleagues in Google Cloud, for example, and it's all about satisfaction with Google Cloud products against competitors. And so there was a big survey that was asking about this sort of stuff. And so we had lots of feedback about things like price, functionality, ease of use, documentation, blah, blah, blah. And so these categories begin to emerge, which are pretty robust, actually. And then, so you can just add these in data validation in Excel or Google Sheets, and then just use the drop down in another column to assign a category to a comment. Very, very basic use of everyday tools for this sort of stuff. There are also there are these now ML AI tools that people have. I'm a bit skeptical about how they really work, but people are starting to use those as well to look at huge numbers of comments. When you have sort of tens or hundreds of thousands of open ends to look through, which we get from our products, because the products that have surveys running the entire time and they collect giant amounts of information. So that's when those things would come into their own.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thank you for sharing your experience, Miroslava and Stefan. We will upload actually this recording to our channel in YouTube, and we'll share a link if you would like to see it once more, or you have some things to clarify. Okay, then that's it. Have a great day. Have a great evening. See you on next meetups. Bye.